And it's a complex issue. That's my opinion on it. Take it or leave it. Any questions about this? No? So now we know that survival is kind of rather specialized knowledge. Now I started teaching survival to recreationists and pilots. As I said, it took a while to realize that you can address the issue that the recreation leaves on Friday evening, comes back on Sunday night. What is the survival that they should become acquainted with that functions for them there? Now, when you're going to survive, what are you going to use to survive with? One, clothing. It was already well understood when I came on the scene in the mid-60s that clothing was quite important in your survival. They call it your first line of defense. And your clothing will also involve an extension of your clothing called the sleeping bag, but that's separate. So first of all, dress properly. If you're going to dress properly and wander around, there are certain rules. You've got a rucksack. You follow that chart that I talked about. And when you go off the beaten path, you carry at least, well, I don't know if I got my figures right, 4.5 centimeters of thickness between what you're wearing and what's in your rucksack. That's what you wear while you're active. But it's not enough if you stop moving. You have to have some strategy to be able to stay comfortable when you're sleeping, because you are generating so little heat through exertion. And the strategy is a fire or a shelter or both, depending on the circumstance. After clothing, it usually means that you need fire to make up with what you fell short on with regard to your clothing. Therefore, you have to know how to light that fire and how to have a big enough fire that that's big enough to force you to stay a step away. If I build a fire that forces me to stay a step away, and I started telling the story about the snow got packed, and the snow was deep enough once it was packed, then when the fire melted the snow that was left was a perfect chair seat high. And that's where I had the epiphany. That's the word that I was looking for. And I said, oh, the fire is strong enough, so when I build it, that forces me to stay a step away, but at a certain point it melts the snow and stops melting. Oh, my shelter has to be within that oval. My bed has to be within that area where the fire has had enough oomph to melt the snow to that point. My shelter can't overlap onto where it's not warm enough. So if the fire melts the snow, it's indicating to me what the fire should be doing. And so if you want to prove to yourself what's a workable fire, it has to be a fire that does that. And we can specify, maybe not right now, but anyway, so there are certain things. So you've got to be able to get a fire going. Now, if you know you're going to light a fire, the person who knows light fire with a bow drill is never going to allow himself or herself to be caught in the bush without matches. And the person that suggests in the survival kit that if you're running short of matches, that I would say that there is a flaw. That same flying book. There was a chapter in the book that said, who are the pilots that are prone to have crashes? This is before the First World War, and it said the pilot who uses a wood chisel instead of a proper screwdriver to tighten his screws, uses a pair of pliers instead of a proper wrench to tighten his bolts. They're the ones that seem to have the crashes. That there is some kind of a mental situation that you're not fully appreciative or on guard. It was already noticed then that this lackadaisical attitude, mechanical-wise, usually will allow you to predict that the person's going to have problems because of the neglect of the machine, you might say. Anyway, so fire. Well, I already said I'm not going to give you your fire badge till you're 35 years old. 3, the knife. Now, I would say for some people, you might say that those are the minimal survival equipment. That's called the survival, under the class, this is survival tools. Anything else is probably derivable. So these are the tools of survival. The rest of the list is the tools of survival training, is my way of looking at it. Well, if you're going to carry a knife and a few other things, and you're going to hurt yourself with fire, until you get good at it, you better carry a first aid kit. And that kit should be on you and not in your pack. So if your shirt doesn't have a pocket to carry that kit, better sew a pocket on, because that's not an appropriate kit to shirt to have on you in survival. And it's so easy to include in that kit a mirror to signal with. And maybe that mirror, might be very useful in, there's a tiny little compact kit, steri strips, and there's a little bit of balsam fir, and there's a signal mirror, a pair of tweezers, and it fits in there. There's one of the students would compile these sort of things. Steri strips pretty well do away with the need to have to suture. And, I never need to suture anybody in my life except myself, and I passed up the opportunity to impress 200 kids that I was so with it that when I cut myself, I sat down and stitched myself together, because my brother taught me how to suture, but I didn't realize how numb. I would have done it if I realized how numb that area became as a result, but that's another story. Yeah, thank you. That doesn't have to look much more than that to be quite handy, especially the mirror is there for eye injuries. You get a particle, it's easy to get a particle of bark or something in your eye, and it's hard to deal with it if you can't see. So the signal mirror also helps you to try to remove something out of your eye. But there are many horror stories. I even have a letter on file about a pilot that took a course from me and then ferried his ultralight and then crashed. And how many planes passed over him, and no one knew that he had crashed. And he figured he was perfect position to signal the aircraft with a mirror, but it was bolted to a survival kit on the aircraft, and he was wedged in so tightly he couldn't reach it. And he said, I have to write you a letter to tell you how important it ran through my mind, how I heard it, but I didn't think it was that important that the signal mirror be on you. There are people, there's one person I met who was on a cut line, and the people who made the cut line, they chose to cut the sticks at angle with their chainsaws and whatever, and he impaled himself with the meaty part of his leg here on one of those, and he couldn't unimpale himself. His only recourse to try to bring attention would be with a mirror if he was in the sunlight and so on. So mirrors are very effective and highly respected means of signaling your distress. So there should be no excuse that you don't know how to use the mirror and you don't carry one. Now, if you take 4 25-cent pieces and stack them on top of each other, there's your compass. Navigation. Know how to use a compass. And it's even enhanced more, like those people that went for the walk. They should have been able to look on a map and see what kind of a hazard they were getting into by examining the contour lines, but they didn't. They just jollily went up there, and on the way down, well, get yourself the magazine and read about it. Yes. And I have little sympathy for a lot of people. Like the guy who goes off in the bush and he's lucky to have a knife on him because he sticks his hand somewhere. Now he's got to cut his hand off. I mean, what do people do? I think it was in the books. He should have died. Why do you stick your hand in something like that that necessitates you having to amputate your arm? But mankind is all kinds. Now, some people might say those are the tools of survival. And after that, well, what do we have after that? Pretty high up, I would say. Sleeping bag, plus knowing how to make a bed, whatever. Simplest way to survive is carrying a sleeping bag. Did you get into problems? My most effective way to not have to build my own camp is I was able to buy these United States Army sleeping bags. They weighed about 9 or 10 pounds. And somebody in Winnipeg got a huge shipment of them and misstored them so they smelled mildewed. They were never been used. And I knew that hang them out in the sun and the sunshine will get rid of the mildew. Worked very effectively. I probably ordered over 100 of them and resold them. But I found 2 of them, one inside the other. But sleeping on a mat, the snow will get between you and the mat. I sewed up a parachute bag. Parachute bag had to be double layered because if you slept in front of the fire, 1 layer wasn't enough to stop the sparks that landed on it. But 2 layers, one stops the spark, the second prevents the sleeping bag from being embroiled. And the sleeping mat went inside and the sleeping bag, and then the snow didn't get between me. And that's how I survived for many years as an instructor, because all we'd have to do is just level out the snow, put down an use an ensolite, aerolite, and that was my shelter, and I slept well and fairly comfortable regardless of how cold it was. Well, you have to have a strategy. Work it out before you go somewhere. Don't go anywhere. Now, if you don't carry a sleeping bag and you say, oh, I'm going to build a camp, what are you going to build a camp with? You better carry a axe handle in your armpit, head in your hand, and the head weighs 2 1/4 pounds. Because you're going to need something like that to be able to chop the wood and build camp and hack up enough firewood because you chose to use that dynamic way. And of course, there's already a person that's part of the course who observes that the amount you need is equivalent to a vehicle, side view of a vehicle on a daily basis, if not from the setting of the sun to the rising of the sun issue. Sleeping bag makes life easier, so your focus is on how well you've chosen that bag and how you know to keep it from deteriorating from constant use, etc., etc. Well chosen in a man's life, there's only 3 bags, and one of them, well chosen. I mean, you put some thinking into it and whatever, and one of them is the one you sleep besides. What I'm essentially saying, if you're really careful in your choice, probably 2 bags is going to take a lifetime for you to wear out 2 good bags. Yeah, when I first met my wife, I thought she was a witch. Now that I've been married for 50 years, I'm more convinced that she's a witch. The reason I thought she was a witch, I probably knew her about a year. We're driving somewhere. She put her hand on my thigh, and I turned into a motel. Sleeping bag and bed. Pot. A pot is so convenient. You can be trained to get by without it. But only guys like me can be comfortable with that approach. The native people, it took 100 years before the native people would accept pots. Well, first of all, they were copper, and they were expensive, and you couldn't fold them. So there is the native people that cooked with stones. They were called the Assiniboines, because the translation of the word Assiniboine is stone cooker. Look how far he is behind the times. He's still cooking with stones. Well, when you start learning how to cook with stones, you'll find the civil engineering involved is reduced unbelievably. So it's not that hard to meet your needs by cooking with stones. But that's another story. It's in bushcraft. You can read up about how you go about doing that. But a pot boils water, carries water, measures water, and you can also use it for digging holes by loosening the ground of the pole and scooping the dirt out with your pot. There's a lot of things there. So for the rescue people, if you've got a pot that folds, there's a lot of merit to carrying everything in your vest. And a normal pot, which should be a 7-cup capacity, is kind of awkward. It's kind of bulky. But if you've got a pot that folds up like an envelope, then 8. Shelter. Now, generally, if you study it, you can devise shelter by using environmental materials. But it's not easy work. And I would say that when you get all the literature, there's only one person on the face of this earth that makes sense out of primitive shelter building, and his name is Morse Kochanski. Everybody else don't have a clue about the whole issue. In particular, when you have a big fire in front of an open lean-to, it's called the inverse cube law, that the effect of your fire is equal to 1 over the distance from it cubed. Now the effect of a glowing object is equal to 1 over the distance squared. But because I had the good fortune to have a heating engineer appear on one of my courses, he says, you know, Morse, the inverse square law, that's for vacuum. He says, you're going to get much closer if you use the inverse cube law. And the inverse cube law will tell you that for every centimeter, every inch that you're away from that fire, you have that much less benefit. So you got to really pay attention to distances. And we'll address that some more when we talk about shelters. And I already said, everything the architect needs to know. And if you don't believe me, and later you'll say, oh, I see his point. That if I'm going to advance in the whole issue of shelter building, I better bone up on what everything that an architect has to know to make a comfortable shelter. Because all those things, if you don't know about them, how are you going to harness them and use them? Because they're there. Break any of the rules, you get nothing. You get aggravation or you get a shortened lifespan. Shelter. Bindcraft. We hold everything together by tying it. So you got to extract all kinds of things that bind. And in your kit, we've already mentioned, with great affection, our 550-200-7. So you compare a survival kit and you discover you've got some room to spare, fill it with paracord. You won't be sorry, because it's what holds everything together. But it's only partially useful unless you know the marvelous knot called the jam knot. If there's anything that you maybe should be appreciative of, is having learned it from us, the most useful knot in creation. Not the bowline, but the jam knot. Later you learn the butter knot, and there's the bread knot too, but the jam knot comes first. More tools. Who are you? Throwing a knife. More tools. You focus on the axe, the saw, the shovel. You're pretty well helpless here when the snow's up to here and you don't have a good scoop shovel. Just because you figure it's too much trouble to bring, might cost you your life. I don't know. There's collapsible saws or collapsible